A 3-story hotel. It was never full, but never empty. Its rooms were not luxurious, and it did not have the best location. In fact, it was right next to a national highway. That was good for business travelers, but terrible for leisure travelers. They kept hearing cars passing by all night long. I chose it for the food. That was the only thing that stood out about the place. All the Google reviews agreed that they offered homemade food at a very affordable price. And to tell the truth, I was also attracted to the price. It wasn't too expensive for being next to the city. I needed to spend a few days in the area because I was writing my new book and I wanted to go to different places, to get out of my comfort zone so the ideas would come to me. It usually worked for me, but I had been sleeping badly for months, so I wasn't sure it would this time. I caught a plane and then a cab. There was no other way to get to the hotel. It was clear that it was geared to clients arriving by road. Otherwise, it was impossible to stay there. As soon as I got out of the cab, I was surprised at how beautiful the exterior facade was. It was spotless and lacked no detail. There were flowers adorning every corner, and the windows were spotlessly clean. I didn't expect that. I thought I would find a typical roadside bar, useful but improvable. I went in happy for what I had found outside and went to the reception. There was a young woman there who, according to my calculations, was not much older than 18. She was perfectly uniformed and at first spoke to me in perfect English. I told her I was from Spain, and she quickly switched languages, apologizing. After recording my details, she escorted me to my room. I was quite surprised with what I was seeing. I didn't understand why people didn't leave better reviews for that place, because apparently it was very good. That made me curious. It was clear that I was missing something. I went up to my room and decided to rest for a while. The trip had been long, and I needed to clear my mind to write. It was still noon, so I had time to get to know the place. I tried not to let too much light through the window and lay down on the bed. I really shouldn't have been aware of how tired I was. I woke up at 8 o'clock in the evening. It was already dark outside and I was very hungry. I was actually quite groggy. Sleeping so many hours during the day was rare for me, but I took a shower and ran downstairs to the dining room. To my surprise, there was no one there. I was all alone in a huge room with stone walls. The same receptionist who had served me in the morning brought me a small laminated sheet where I could read the menu. I wanted to try everything, but I was going to stay 2 weeks, and I didn't want to bore the food. So I opted for the pasta carbonara. I was so hungry that I needed something hearty, something that would satisfy me. And the truth is that it did. It was a very generous portion, and it was absolutely delicious. Maybe it was because of hunger, but at that moment I thought it was the best pasta I had ever eaten in my life. I was offered dessert, but I'm not much of a sweet tooth, so I declined. I simply ordered a tea and just sat there watching. I was again surprised that no one else came into the dining room. It was dinner time, and I knew there were more guests. The receptionist came back from time to time to ask me if I needed anything. I saw absolutely no one. I decided to go out to the back garden. I would take advantage of the fact that it was still early to read. There were more people there. Everyone was engrossed in their books, cell phone or headphones, so I didn't exchange a single word with them. But I did notice that when I saw myself leaving the dining room, they all looked at me. I thought it was simply because I was new. I immersed myself in my reading and lost track of time. 2 hours later, the lights went out in the garden. I understood that it was time for each guest to go to their room, so without thinking too much, I took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Through the corridors, I saw quite a few people, and that reminded me again that the dining room was empty. I made my own mental note to check the prices of the food, so I wouldn't spend my paycheck just to eat. I brushed my teeth and got into bed, but after sleeping all afternoon, I knew I wasn't going to fall asleep that quickly. I grabbed my book again and plunged back into the world of the main character, Sarah. I stayed like that until I heard some strange noises in the next room. They were quite loud thumps, as if they were throwing furniture on the floor. I thought it was a couple having a heated argument, only to make up later, but suddenly I heard the door open, and the noises stopped. There were footsteps in the hallway and nothing else. How I missed having a peephole in the door. Around 4 a.m. I fell asleep. The next day, the dining room looked like something else. There were 8 of us guests, and everyone was having breakfast happily. 2 of them came up to me. "Hi, how are you? Are you new?" I told them yes, and they told me they had also just arrived. Luis had separated from his wife and needed a few days away from everything. He didn't have money to pay for a spiritual retreat, but since the hotel had a garden and a forest in the back, it suited him. Mario, on the other hand, was a publicist and was on his way from one congress to another. He was going to work from there. We spent a long time chatting about our things, and then I went to my room to write. The creative life, although it may not seem like it, also needs a schedule. We agreed to meet at lunchtime, and that made me quite happy. It's always good to eat together. The morning flew by. I'd decided on several important points in my new novel. I usually write mystery prose, but to tell the truth, maintaining that thread of tension is very complicated, so sometimes I need moments of disconnection. At the appointed time, I went down to the dining room. My 2 new friends were waiting for me at the table. There was only one other person there. After greeting them, I told them that I was surprised that there were so few people in the dining room when the food was so good. Mario said that the night before, he had seen a man eating a sandwich in the hallway. The 3 of us agreed that maybe they couldn't afford that much. Still, I kept thinking. The receptionist, who was as spotless as the first day, left us the menu and added that there were several dishes with the house specialty, mushrooms. I had no idea that was the specialty, but I hated them with all my might. My parents used to give them to me when I was little, until they discovered that they were bad for me, and I was able to get rid of them. I ordered a salad and a veal steak. Mario had rice with seafood, and Luis went for the mushrooms. He said they were delicious, but just looking at them made me sick. Before we left, the receptionist came back to our table. She asked Luis which room he was in. Apparently, there were some glitches in his registration. The afternoon passed normally. After writing for a couple of hours, I met the guys for a walk around. Luis was feeling a bit under the weather. He said the nap had left him groggy, but he was still encouraged to walk around in the fresh air for a while. We wandered into the woods out back and discovered a large greenhouse. We wanted to look around to see what they were planting, but it was hermetically sealed on all sides. We only saw a couple of workers, but when we greeted them, they didn't even answer us. They lowered their heads and continued on their way. We laughed at their sassiness and kept walking. The surroundings were truly beautiful. There were trees of all species and lots of vegetation. We also saw a kind of shed. It was locked with padlocks and the windows had bars on them. In addition, a little before the entrance, there was a sign prohibiting anyone outside the company from entering. What company? I asked myself. As a writer, all these mysterious things aroused in me a great curiosity. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want my new friends to think I was crazy. I shut my mouth and we continued walking. Luis was already feeling much better. The walk had been great for him. We returned just in time for dinner. We entered the dining room, but not before crossing paths with a couple of people who looked at us strangely. Now it wasn't just me who was surprised. My colleagues commented on it as well. People were surprised that we were using the hotel dining room so much. What was the point of that? We sat down, and again the receptionist brought us the menu. To tell the truth, I already knew it by heart. She insisted that we could sit separately if we wanted, but all 3 of us agreed that we preferred to eat together. Louise was offered a sautéed mushroom dish and asked us if we would like to try it this time. Mario said yes, but he wanted a tiny portion just to taste them. I continued with my disgust for those plants and asked for a fish soup. This time the receptionist wanted to check Mario's room. I fell asleep very early that night. I was awakened by a loud knock on the door at about 2 a.m. It was Luis, who felt sick and wanted to know if I had any medicine for my stomach. He looked terrible, but I didn't have any. I rarely got sick, and when I did, it was usually a sore throat. He told me he would try to find someone around the hotel, and I offered to go get help instead. When I came downstairs, the receptionist was in her chair. This girl ever sleep? I went over, giving her a good scare, and told her what was going on. She told me that they had a doctor on staff and would send him to Louise's room right away. I was very surprised that they had a doctor on staff. Not even in the big resorts did they have one. I went upstairs and told Louise that the doctor would be right there. I went back to my room and immediately fell asleep. That night I had nightmares about the greenhouse we'd seen in the afternoon. I woke up with a strange feeling. I usually have good instincts, and they didn't fail me that day either. I went down to breakfast very early. Mario was there, as always eager to have his first coffee of the day. We waited a long time for Louise to come down, but he didn't show up. I was quite worried, so I asked the receptionist if she knew anything. She told me that Louise was resting, as the doctor had recommended. It made perfect sense, so I went on with my day. The mornings were being quite productive in that place. I was making good progress on my novel, but that day, I was distracted. I couldn't stop thinking about the mysteriousness of the place. I told Mario that I preferred to walk alone that afternoon, that I needed to find inspiration for one of my chapters. We arranged to meet for dinner, and I left just before lunch. I wasn't hungry, so I thought I'd go to a supermarket and have a snack. After shopping, I went back to the back of the hotel. Everything was the same as the last time we walked there. There was no way to see what they were planting, not even a small hole in the tarp. I passed a worker who again looked away from me, but this time I insisted. "Excuse me, do you know what they plant here?" He turned and said, "You wouldn't want to know," and went on his way. His face was totally haggard, pale, and with a lot of dark circles under his eyes. I then approached the shed and accessed the back. I tried to see through the window what was inside, but I could see only black tarpaulins. They were covering some piles of dirt. Nothing looked suspicious. I decided to leave and come back at night. There were things that didn't add up, and after what the operator had told me, I needed answers. When I came back, I met Mario at the entrance. He had heard strange noises in Louise's room. That's why he had knocked on the door, but no one opened it. Later, he saw the cleaners enter his room, which now had the door wide open. No one was there. Louise would not have left without saying goodbye, so I quickly went down to reception. The young lady very kindly told me that indeed the guest in 302 had gone home to recuperate fully. She asked him to give us his regards just like that. That sounded very strange to me. And to top it off, now it was Mario who was unwell. I asked him what he had eaten, and he told me ravioli stuffed with mushrooms. Then it all made sense to me. Maybe they were using the wrong mushrooms. But were they doing it on purpose? If they were causing indigestion among the guests, surely they had already thought about it. I still had several days left, so I would keep an eye on things. In any case, I told Mario not to eat any more mushrooms. He answered, "What are you talking about, man? They're delicious." That night, as I had planned, I went back down. I grabbed my Swiss Army knife and went first to the greenhouse. I was convinced to cut the tarp to see what was hidden inside, but something caught my eye. 2 workers were wheeling a wheelbarrow toward the shed. They opened the door and went inside. I didn't know whether to follow them or to go ahead with my plan, and in the end, I opted for the second option. I thought that if they were distracted there, they would not notice my presence. I managed to gain access to the greenhouse, and then I could read a label, Amanitas phalloides. What was that? I had no idea, but I wrote it down in my notebook and ran out of there. I hid under some bushes and waited to see if the workers would come out, but nothing. There was light in there, and for the 2 hours I was hiding, nobody came out of the shed. What could they be doing for so long? The situation became an obsession. My instinct told me that something strange was going on, but there was little else I could do at that moment, so I went back to my room. I turned on the computer and Googled Amanitas phalloides, and then I understood everything. It's a very poisonous mushroom species, although similar in appearance to other edible mushrooms. They were poisoning people. I couldn't wait and ran to Mario's room. I knocked on the door several times, but no one would open it. I was completely desperate. I didn't want anything bad to happen to him, so I decided to go down to the kitchen. I was lucky that the receptionist was not in her place, so I got through without any problems. The kitchen was also deserted, and I didn't find anything strange. What could I do with that information? Should I call the police? I decided to wait for the next day and talk to Mario. But the next day, Mario did not show up. Again, the receptionist told me that he had left because he was indisposed. I thought that was absurd, so I ran off in the direction of the shed. The receptionist kept shouting my name and asking me to stop, but I didn't. I reached the entrance, and just then 2 workers were coming out. I pushed them away and lifted one of the tarpaulins. I couldn't believe it. They were Louise and Mario. They were dead and piled up next to other bodies. The receptionist was following me closely, and when she saw me inside, she took a gun out of her pocket. But just at that moment, a police patrol arrived and saved me. One of the operators, seeing what was about to happen, had reported what had happened. He could not carry more dead bodies. Upon inspecting the area, they found the famous hotel cook. She was an old lady, hairless and with many kilos. At the time of the arrest, she was in the greenhouse, fertilizing her mushrooms with human body parts. After many investigations, they concluded that the people in charge of that organization were experimenting with different amounts of poisonous fungus, to see how far the bodies would resist. Once they died, they performed a thorough autopsy. In this way, they were creating an even more poisonous fungus, more and more lethal. I didn't finish my novel, but I decided this story deserved to be told, because I could never think of anything more terrifying than my vacation in a roadside hotel.
After the sudden death of her son, Vicky had fallen into a deep depression. Her husband, Carl, tried to help her recover, encouraged her to seek professional help, but she clung to her pain as if it were her only comfort. Her life had come to a standstill the same day that cancer had taken her little one from her. One day, while searching for entertainment on the internet, Vicky saw a very strange advertisement. It promised a solution to their despair, a special doll that could bring back the memories and presence of deceased people. She closed the page, cursing how much people took advantage of painful situations for financial gain. However, something had stirred her inside. What would that doll do? Would they make them like people, and could they ease the pain of missing someone? The truth was that since the incorporation of artificial intelligence into today's life, anything was possible. Even creating identical digital people. It could be something to do with her assumptions, and they didn't seem so crazy to her anymore. So she grabbed her cell phone, searched for the ad again, and contacted the seller. He assured her that the doll was more than just a toy. It would have the energy and memories of her son. So it's just a doll? She thought. It didn't inspire much confidence. But desperate to feel her son's presence again, she accepted the seller's fee to begin the creation process. When she mentioned it to her husband, he showed his discontent. "Please, Vicky, don't you see that they're taking advantage of you? A doll? But are you hearing yourself? I know it's hard, it's been hard for me too, but you have to start accepting reality. Jake is gone, honey." The woman began to cry uncontrollably. She was short of breath. She had a new anxiety crisis. The husband knew that he shouldn't encourage her to move on, but he couldn't bear to see her suffer like this. He would do anything to get his wife out of that hole full of sadness. So he promised her that he would support her in purchasing that doll. The seller asked the woman for several items. Photos, objects that the child always carried with him or that were very precious to him, clothes that retained their smell and that had not been washed, and several more elements. Vicky had everything he needed, and as important objects for the little one, she would give him his baseball glove. He loved to play and wore it all the time. That same day, she paid him half of the order and sent him all the items that were needed. She wanted to have that doll as soon as possible. Days later, the seller showed up at their house with a large box. Vicky received him nervously and asked the merchant to go down to the basement. They went down the stairs and the woman turned on the lights. It was a spacious place, with boxes full of the little boy's objects. The parents had not found enough strength to get rid of them. The seller placed the box on a large table. Meanwhile, Carl watched them with a disapproving face, sitting on the stairs. Vicky, with a broken voice, asked him if that would really work. The man, with a big smile, replied that no one had ever asked him to return the money. Carl shook his head, regretting that he had let someone rip them off at their house. She watched expectantly as the seller carefully opened the box. Inside, wrapped in delicate paper, was a doll. As if he were presenting a treasure, he asked the woman to look inside. There was a doll of poor quality. It seemed to be made of rags. It didn't look anything like the child. You could only recognize his clothes and his baseball glove on his hand. The salesman was waiting for Vicky's impression, who still hadn't said a word. Then he asked her what she thought, but it wasn't her who answered, but Carl. "I'm gonna tell you what I think. It seems to me that you have laughed at the wrong family. You should be ashamed of taking advantage of other people's misfortunes. Did you charge us that much money for a rag doll? I thought you would try harder." Carl was about to throw that man out of the house when suddenly he saw his wife smiling while holding the doll in her arms. A tear fell as he heard the sound of her laughter again. He didn't understand anything, but Vicky was happy, hugging and talking to that rag doll. "Oh, Jake, I've missed you so much, honey." Carl couldn't understand anything. The seller didn't ignore his expression of uncertainty and encouraged him to hold the doll in his arms. He looked again at his wife, who was tearfully kissing that piece of cloth, and with distrust, he grabbed the cloth hand. Suddenly, he could see his son in his wife's arms. It was him! His little hands, his smell, his hair. Is it Jake?" Carl asked. The salesman nodded. Yes, it's him. All his memories, his energy are inside this doll. When he released his son's hand, the man again saw his wife hugging the rag doll. She was very excited. She couldn't stop smiling. But that didn't inspire confidence in him. He had serious doubts that this would help his wife face the child's death. He asked Vicky to leave the doll in the box and they could talk about it privately. But his wife didn't even want to listen to him. She took out of her pocket the envelope that contained the other half of the money she owed the seller and thanked him for that creation. Before leaving, the merchant told them that they should talk about the instruction manual for that doll. He told them that their house was the place where his little one's spiritual imprint had been left. The essence of his former being remained there, and that doll was a container to channel all that energy. "Only in this house? What happens if we go somewhere else with him?" Vicky asked worriedly. The seller made a sign to her with his hand, inviting her to go out into the street with a little one in her arms. They left the basement, and as soon as they crossed the entrance door, she was alerted to see that she was hugging a piece of cloth again. She got scared, and the man explained that outside of their home, Jake was just a doll. The woman went inside with him again, worried and alarmed. But she breathed a sigh of relief when she saw that her little one was hugging her neck again. Carl closed his eyes as he placed his hands on his face in disapproval. Then he looked at the seller and asked how many more warnings there were. The man answered that there was only one. He put his hand in the pocket of his jacket and showed him a small hourglass. Placing it in front of his eyes while the sand passed from the upper side to the lower side, he warned him that they shouldn't spend more time than it took for all the sand to fall from one side to the other with him. When time was up, they had to put him in his box for a whole day, and until that whole day had passed, they weren't to take him out again. That indication intrigued Carl, so he asked him what would happen if they didn't comply with that rule. The salesman replied, "My product is like an addiction, pleasant but dangerous if abused. If you don't follow this rule, you will lose control. You will believe the lie. You will believe that the doll is real, and after a while, you won't even have to touch it for the illusion to work. You will always see it as a normal human being. You will forget about the cancer that took your son. You'll even forget that you hired me. Your mind will bury what it doesn't need and fill those spaces to keep the lie alive. Of course, if any of this happens, I'm not responsible. You've been warned." Carl stared at his wife, who was laughing and hugging that piece of fabric. He was worried about what would happen if she didn't follow the rules. If she would be able to leave that doll in the box for a whole day. Having the feeling of recovering their little one again was very dangerous. But at that moment, he knew he had no options. She was too excited. Time passed, and Carl saw how that doll had seriously affected Vicky's mental health. She didn't pay attention to anything or anyone other than that piece of cloth. She didn't care about never leaving the house again, interacting with more people. Everything she needed was with her. It had been a while since she had turned the hourglass, and she refused to leave the Jake doll in the place the seller had indicated. She dedicated her entire day to feeding him purees and playing with him. She spoke to him as if he were her real son, completely ignoring the reality around her. She didn't comb her hair, she didn't shower, it had become an obsession. Meanwhile, Carl, increasingly worried, tried to convince her to get rid of the doll, but she flatly refused. Just as the seller had said, she no longer needed to touch the doll to be able to see it alive. She didn't remember that this was the result of an illusion. One morning, very early, her husband found her in the living room, singing lullabies to the doll while swinging it in her arms. He asked her if she had been up all night, but she pretended not to hear him and continued rocking her baby while humming. Carl reminded her of the words he had said to her after their son's funeral. He told her that life could sometimes be cruel, but that everyone has the strength within to be able to overcome the difficulties of life. However, he felt like he had lost her. Carl began to cry, and Vicky stopped her rocking and singing and stared piercingly at her husband. Carl was devastated. He couldn't continue with that situation. He looked at his wife and told her that they should face this problem together. But she looked at him with empty eyes. She was completely lost in her delirium. One afternoon, as Carl was getting out of the shower, he heard laughter coming from the room. His wife was sitting on the floor, hugging the doll and muttering incoherent words. Carl approached slowly, trying to bring his wife back to reality, but when he tried to take the doll out of her hands, she reacted furiously, screaming and scratching him as if she were a wild cat. Then he understood that that doll hadn't brought comfort to his wife, but rather an even deeper darkness, which consumed her day by day. He was trapped in a nightmare, not knowing if he would be able to get his wife back or if that doll had taken her sanity forever. Once again, he insisted to his wife that she should stay away from the doll for a while, but she refused. "It's not a doll, he's my son." Carl sighed and asked again to put Jake in his box, although he knew that she wouldn't. She turned around and hugged her son again, speaking to him as if Carl had already left there. Then the man, very nervous, grabbed her by the arm and made her follow him to the front door. She tried to free herself while holding her little boy tightly in her arms. The woman began to scream and cry inconsolably, asking him not to do it, not to hurt her little Jake. Then, just before she walked through the door, he told her, "Vicky, I'm just going to take you outside so you can see what you really have in your arms." Right after, the man went outside and noticed how his hands were released from the fabric of his wife's dress. It was no longer her, but a doll who had her son's doll in her arms. Carl started to shake. He couldn't understand anything. Why his wife had fallen apart and turned into a piece of rag? Then images began to come to his mind. The moments in which his wife began to lose her mind over their son's doll. She had lost her mind, and although he had tried to help her, it had not been possible. Since she didn't listen to reason, Carl decided to put an end to the situation and hid the doll. Vicky kept insisting, asking him to give her son back, but he remained firm. It broke his heart to see how his wife suffered, but that doll had made her lose her mind. He had to put an end to that false illusion that their son was with her again. However, Vicky could not stand it. She had lost the person she loved most twice, and her life stopped making sense. She sank into darkness and ended up in the same cemetery as her little boy. After his wife's death, Carl went to see the seller again, demanding an explanation. That doll had ended his wife's trial and ultimately her life. The man replied, "I told you it wouldn't be my responsibility, friend. I explained the rules to you. You just had to comply with the instructions." Carl, desperate, asked him to bring her back. Vicky was his reason for life. Without her, nothing made sense. His love for her was the only thing that had made him continue fighting after his son's death. "Well, I'll need some photos, her unwashed clothes, and some valuable objects of hers." The salesman's words echoed in his head as Carl returned to reality and looked at the doll on the floor dressed in his wife's clothes. The illusion of seeing her alive had made him forget everything, even his own death. He didn't remember hiring the doll maker again, desperate to have Vicky back in his arms. He grabbed the doll and hugged it with tears in his eyes. Then he took her back inside the house, where the cloth turned back into skin, and his wife returned with him. "I'm so sorry, darling. I won't do it again. I won't take you out of the house again. I will stay with you always, I promise." Meanwhile, on the living room table, there were the 2 hourglasses that the seller had given him, and both were broken, with the sand scattered. Jenny was a 13-year-old girl. She was very excited because for the first time the circus had come to her town. She had never visited one, so she tried in every way possible to convince her parents to take her. Her family was humble and she didn't have enough savings to pay for 3 tickets. But Jenny was so excited that she used the money she had saved from her birthdays to pay half the price, and the other half her parents would put up to make her happy. That day in the morning, she was so happy that she told the news to all her classmates. Many told her that they would meet there because their parents would also take them. However, one of her best friends, Tom, pouted and told her that he had to talk to her alone. The young man had heard horrible rumors about that circus in nearby towns. Jenny thought he was just jealous that she could go and he couldn't, but she asked what those rumors were about. Tom told her that in the back of the circus, the actors kidnapped children and did horrible things to them. Jenny frowned. She didn't believe anything. When she asked what kind of things it was, the boy told her that he didn't know anything else, only that it was a very dangerous place. Jenny angrily accused him of trying to scare her. The boy, annoyed by her reaction, turned around and left without saying another word. Jenny wasn't going to let her friend spoil her happiness for the day, so when it was time to get out of school, she ran home to get ready for the circus show. The tent was installed in the village forest. Jenny arrived with her parents half an hour before the show, but there was already a long line of people at the box office buying their tickets. While her parents waited for their turn, the young woman approached the side of the tent where she saw several actors pass by who were practicing part of the show. Very excited, she couldn't help herself and went after them. One of the artists realized that the girl was following them, and when his companions were confused, he backed away and approached her stealthily. He told her to get away from there. That was a dangerous place. The actor asked her to return to her parents' side and ran back to his companions. Jenny remembered what her friend Tom had told her at school, so she decided to go back to the entrance. However, when she was walking back, one of the actors got in her way. He asked her where she was going and if she wanted to see some of the animals they kept in their cages. The young woman looked at him with wide eyes and excitedly replied that she would love to see the lion and tiger up close. The actor shook her hand and invited her to enter the tent. Jenny felt that what she was doing was wrong. If her parents didn't find her, they would be distraught. She asked the artist to let her out, but he gripped her hand tighter. The young woman could perceive a rotten smell. In that place, there were many cages, but no animals. She approached one of them and she could see that they were full of human corpses. She started to run towards the exit, but an acrobat with a macabre smile stopped her, tying her up and covering her eyes with a white band. Right after, shouts were heard inside the tent, and the public that was outside in line began to applaud, believing that it was part of the show to create expectation of what they were going to find there. The acrobat put his lips to Jenny's ears and said in a raspy voice, "This is the place that will make you belong to the circus forever. Deformed diva." "Am I going to die, doctor?" David asked me as they put him in the operation room. The boy, just 10 years old, had been crushed in a terrible car accident. The anesthetist proceeded to put him to sleep. Once we started the operation, we saw that there was hardly any chance of him resisting. Despite this, we put all our efforts into saving his life, but after half an hour, his heart stopped. My colleagues told me that his father had also died in the accident. A disgrace. I proceeded to stitch his open abdomen to take him to the morgue, and just as I put the needle through, his body trembled. I withdrew my hand, wondering what had caused that post-mortem spasm. But suddenly, the boy gasped, and as if it were a horror movie, he opened his eyes and uttered a piercing cry. I stumbled back in fright, and I quickly asked the whole team for help. Those who were leaving the room ran back in, all looking panicked at the sight of the boy they had left for dead, screaming on the operating table. The anesthetist tried to put him back into sedation. The pain he felt with his body open had to be horrible. But none of us could believe it when we saw on the monitors that his heart hadn't started beating again. He would have to be dead, but he was alive with his heart stopping. I started doing chest compressions. His ribs creaked under my hands and the anesthesia wasn't working. What is happening to me? The boy, still conscious, stammered. None of us responded. Nobody knew what to say. We had faced many challenges in our career, but never anything like this. I took a deep breath and tried to maintain my composure. You had an accident, David. The anesthetist grabbed my shoulder and whispered in my ear that we should isolate the operating room, that this could be contagious. While they called security from the prep room, the kid kept asking me questions. He asked me about his father. I couldn't lie to him. I had to tell him that he had died. Then he started sobbing and asked me if he was dying too. A river of tears fell down my face. I shook his hand and told him, "You are not alone. I will stay with you until the end." The Center for Disease Control had been alerted to our situation. There was nothing we could do but hope and pray that it wasn't contagious. The boy was in a lot of pain, and I could only keep him distracted. Hours later, the prevention team arrived, fully equipped in their suits. They had evacuated another room for all the doctors that were there, but I decided to stay where the little one was. No one should have to suffer alone, especially with all those people doing hundreds of tests. "Doctor, I can't see," David yelled. I examined his pupils and found that they didn't respond. "I'm very afraid." I stayed by his side. I told him that everything was fine, but each time he yelled at me more, as if he didn't hear me. Within minutes, he lost his hearing. He had gone deaf and blind. I could no longer communicate with him. I wanted to comfort him, tell him that I would stay with him, not to be afraid. I could not stop crying. The prevention agents decided that my presence had become unnecessary. David wouldn't stop crying. "No, I promised that I would stay with him." Suddenly, the little boy stopped screaming. Did he die? I demanded that they inform me of their condition, and they told me that the only organ that was still active was the brain. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't hear, but he was still in excruciating pain. They covered him with an airtight capsule, and I never saw him again. When my quarantine ended, I contacted a friend who worked on the prevention team and had no record of David's case. Days later, a lawyer and a doctor showed up at my house. They told me what I had been infected with, and I had to sign a confidentiality document. They gave me an injection, but it wasn't a cure. It would only prevent me from spreading that disease. My end will be just like that of little David. I just hope someone sticks with me when it happens.
Charles loved to hike in the mountains on Saturdays, which was his day off. There, he was able to clear his head and feel connected with nature. This was a habit he had maintained since he was young, after overcoming one of the harshest times in his life. That day, the sun shined as if it was summer, so Charles wanted to make the most out of it by exploring new routes. Thus, he chose to go as deep into the forest as possible. He always wanted to explore the forest more deeply, but the bad weather always prevented him from doing so. Charles walked aimlessly through the forest for a long while, until he suddenly noticed that the sunlight was gone. Instead, dark clouds had arrived, heralding a coming storm. And sure enough, it started raining shortly after. It rained more and more intensely, preventing Charles from seeing his way clearly. Disoriented, he chose a totally random route. He needed to find an exit before the entire ground turned into mud. Then, far away, he noticed what he thought was a human figure. Charles yelled to try to catch their attention, but the figure just kept on walking, and the noise from the rain made it impossible to hear anything. And although Charles tried to follow that figure, he soon lost sight of it, but found something more interesting instead. It was a cabin. It seemed to be in good condition, and Charles could use it as a shelter while he waited for the rain to stop. He knocked on the door, but nobody answered. The door wasn't locked either, so he just let himself in. There was a lit candle, so he thought that the owner must have been the figure he saw under the rain, and that he or she would soon come back. Charles looked around that warm place. It was small, and the walls were decorated with strange paintings, which showed deformed faces, as if they were works of abstract art. And while he waited for the owner to arrive, Charles fell asleep. He had nightmares about those strange paintings. He dreamed that they were coming out of their canvases and chased him around the forest. It was nighttime, and it was still raining, so Charles could only see the nearest tree trunks in his way. Suddenly, he saw himself surrounded by those strange figures with inhuman faces. They were approaching him slowly, and when one extended its arm to grab his neck, Charles woke up. The sensation had been so realistic, he thought he was dead for a few minutes. When he got out of his trance and realized he was still at the cabin, he tried to calm down. He could feel his temples palpitating. Then, a strong and annoying ray of light was projected onto his eye. It was finally morning, and it wasn't raining anymore. Charles got up, grabbed his belongings, and prepared to get out, but stopped in the living room first. He noticed that the paintings with deformed faces drawn on them weren't paintings, but windows. He rushed out of that cabin, running with all his might. Unfortunately, nobody knows what happened to him. Nobody ever heard from Charles ever again.
How are you, horror lovers? Today, we bring you a legend from the province of Pontevedra, Spain. There, we find a cemetery in the small town of Mondariz, which has terrified several generations. Juan Luis had gone on vacation to Pontevedra with several friends. The first days were dedicated to seeing the city center, and then they decided to visit the small towns in the surroundings. Thus, they arrived in Mondariz and stayed in a hotel located in the vicinity of a forest. One of his friends wanted to go out at night to visit the woods. Although the rest didn't feel like it much, they accompanied him down the park path. After walking for a kilometer, they arrived at a cemetery. It had a very tall gate with iron gates. The group of friends decided to go in to browse. The cemetery seemed to be abandoned. The grass wasn't tended, and there were half-open graves. After making a detour, they left the place and found a man running terrified. Seeing them, he told them to hide very well, because if they didn't, they would die. The boys laughed at the man, and he disappeared into the darkness. They continued on their way when suddenly they heard a kind of murmuring. Shortly after, they saw a glow approaching them and heard footsteps. Juan Luis and his friends looked at each other and scared, they ran to the cemetery again to hide. They didn't want to look at what or who they were. They stood quietly behind a wall as they felt a group of people walk past them. At that moment, it began to smell very strongly of burning. The group remained completely still and silent until little by little the footsteps receded. When they no longer heard anything, they came out of their hiding place and saw footprints on the damp ground. The trail of footsteps followed the same direction that the man who had run away had taken. Juan Luis and his friends left the forest and returned to the hotel. When they entered, there was an old man at the reception who, seeing them, yelled at them, asking them to explain why they had gone out into the woods at night. After telling them what happened, the man began to pray for them. He told them that at night, in the Galician mountains, and especially with a full moon, you can find the Santa Compa. If someone crosses this group of hooded persons, they will give him a burning bone as a torch to wander with them for the rest of eternity. You cannot look at them. If someone dares to do so, he must draw a circle on the ground and stay inside until they pass by. And whoever doesn't dare to look at them, he must hide very well and pray that they don't see him. In Mondariz Cemetery, only the victims of the Santa Compa were buried. It is said that these souls are cursed, which is why the place is hidden away from the town. Juan Luis asked the old man about the footsteps they had heard, to which the man replied that it could be the steps of the Santa Compa. The group of friends never knew what happened that night, but the man who ran away next to the cemetery never returned to town. Samantha was browsing her Instagram account when she received a new follow request. She didn't know the name, Warmuse T, so she got into the stranger's profile. He didn't have his list of followers or personal information visible. The strangest thing was his photo, a person with a realistic pig mask. The image sent a shiver down her spine. but she thought he would be some kind of alternative internet artist, so she accepted his request. The young woman continued on the social network viewing the stories of her friends when she received a new direct message. It was from Wormius T. He hadn't written any greetings or words, he had simply sent her a photograph where she could see a slaughterhouse. Seeing all those animals hanging from hooks made her feel a mixture of sorrow and nausea. Angry, she texted him asking who he was and why he was sending her such a horrible image. But Wormius didn't reply. As it was already late and the next day she had to get up early to go to school, she left the mobile on her nightstand and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, the sound of an Instagram notification woke her up. Half sleepy, she glanced over and saw that the stranger had sent her another image. She opened it and instantly her face paled. It was a photograph of the same slaughterhouse, but this time there were no pigs hanging on the hooks. It was her father! It could not be true. Another image was uploaded to the chat. With her heart in her throat, Samantha opened the photograph. In this case, it was her mother. The young woman repeated to herself that all was a nightmare or a good Photoshop montage to play a practical joke on her. With tears in her eyes, she got up to check if her parents were still sleeping in the room. But when she arrived, she found the room empty. The phone fell from her hands and she began to scream in a heartbreaking manner, calling her parents. Suddenly, something tapped on the window insistently. Terrified, Samantha slowly opened the curtains and saw him. A person in a pig mask was at the window. Wormius T said hello.
Hello, horror lovers. Japanese legends are especially terrifying, so we love sharing them in this channel. Today, we'll share with you what happened to Kai when he had a terrible encounter with a terrible creature. Akaname is a yokai, or Japanese demon, whose name means filth sucker. It has a horrible appearance and produces perturbing sounds when it swallows with its long tongue all the garbage it can come across. It usually lives in bathrooms, so if you hear strange sounds during the night and they come from the bathroom, it's likely that it's not the pipes nor an insect. It isn't known how those creatures come in and out of those places, but they do have a preference for the oldest and most unkempt bathrooms, since they accumulate the most filth, attracting them to lick them clean. We want to share with you the story of Kai and his group. They didn't know where to film a video about abandoned places, which they had to deliver the next week. They were researching places until a member found the perfect one, a tiny hospital, which had been abandoned for 15 years, located 1 hour away by train. Each member went home to get the necessary equipment, cameras, microphones, and mobile phones. They met at the station just 1 hour before it got dark. They would film the entire night and would come back in the morning on the first train home. They reached the abandoned hospital. It was a huge building built during the war as the main clinic for wounded soldiers, and it kept on operating until it eventually closed down due to lack of use. They started filming the exterior and showed all the graffiti on the walls, which could barely be seen anymore due to the vegetation covering the walls. The place looked very bad, and the group had to walk carefully in case bricks were to fall on them. Nightfall came, and with it, intense coldness. The group looked for the entrance, but the door was blocked from the inside. They remembered that as soon as they got there, they saw an open hole on the lower part of the building, so they decided to get in through there. They couldn't avoid feeling sick when they smelled the inside of that hospital, but there was no going back. Either they would have to sleep inside or freeze to death outside. The whole place was filthy and destroyed. There were papers and stains all over the floor, and when they walked, the papers would stick to their shoes. They still needed to film more places in the hospital and decided to split up. Kai went to film the bathroom with one of his partners, and they couldn't contain their expression of surprise when they got there and saw that everything was clean. There was not a single stain to be seen. That could only mean that someone had been there recently, or maybe that someone was still there. Kai's partner took out his camera and went to the toilet stalls. Then a scream of horror resounded in the entire floor. Scared but determined, Kai wanted to check that his friend was okay and peeked in, only to find the camera thrown on the floor. Thinking his friend was just playing a prank on him, Kai opened the doors of the stalls one by one. When he arrived at the third one, he felt a drop fall on his head. He was petrified for a few seconds before looking at the ceiling of the bathroom. He clearly saw a slimy monster, and its tongue was getting closer and closer to Kai. Scared and with no strength to scream, Kai rushed out of there to look for the rest of the group. He found them at the front desk and told them what happened. They decided to rush out of the hospital and call the police. The next day, the police gave back the camera to the parents of the partner who disappeared, and they never saw their son again.
I remember the night I turned 14. We were waiting for my father to come home. My mother and I were sitting by the fireplace, chatting and keeping an eye on the dinner to keep it warm on the fire. At last, we heard his voice and his brisk knocking on the door, and my mother got up to open it. My father looked depressed, pale, and sad. He walked over to the fireplace, sat down on a stool, and rested his hands on his knees. My mother was nervous and asked if something had happened to him. At that point, he looked at her regretfully and said, "I'm not going to lie to you, my dear. Maybe I have little time left. I have seen the white cat." My mother suddenly turned pale and crossed herself. Then, trying to recover, she asked him if he was joking. My father assured her that he wouldn't joke about something like that. He had seen a white cat with green eyes and a back arched like a bridge. My father finished his story in a low voice and with his eyes fixed on the fire. My mother panicked and began to pray. I was also terribly frightened and I wanted to cry because I knew what the appearance of the white cat meant. The reason my father had this terrible feeling was because all the members of my family who had received a similar encounter died soon after, as if it were a warning of their imminent death. That prophecy had never failed, and it didn't fail this time either. A week later, my father fell ill with a high fever and died within a month. This curse has been associated with my family for 80 years. I talked a long time ago with elderly relatives who clearly remembered everything related to this case. It happened as follows. My great-uncle was at that time the owner of the old Drumconial farm. He was rich, but money doesn't soften a hard heart, and unfortunately, he was a cruel man. At that time, there lived in the mountains a pretty girl. Her family was not wealthy, but she was so beautiful that many men were interested in being her partner, as was my great-uncle. He fell in love, but finally behaved badly with her. He promised her that she would be his wife and convince her to go with him. However, later he got tired of her and ended up marrying a young woman who had a great fortune. In this way, he became even richer, and her former partner died of a broken heart. One night, he was coming home from a fair. As he was reaching the farm, he saw a fast-moving white thing glide slowly across the ground and disappeared into the darkness. He had to pass by an oak branch, but at that moment, the horse stopped. My great-uncle yelled at him, got down to take him by the reins, but the animal backed away. He got back on the horse. He was very angry at the resistance of the animal and used the whip viciously. Suddenly, the horse began to move, and my great-uncle, passing under the branches of the oak tree, saw clearly beside him a woman with her arm outstretched. As he passed her, she hit him hard on the back, causing him to hit his head on the horse's neck. The animal, terrified, came running to the door of the man's house. More dead than alive, my great-uncle walked in. He told his story, but assured that he hadn't recognized the woman's face. However, when he spoke to the priest, he told him that she was the ghost of his ex-partner, whom he had abandoned. From that moment on, my great-uncle never recovered, and soon after, he died. At the wake, the corpse was placed in a small room. Afterwards, they left him alone while they made preparations to bury him. As one of the maids approached the bed, she left the room with a cry. She said the man had his head up and was staring at the door with wide eyes. One of the farm workers accused her of being crazy. Another one told her that it had been her imagination when she entered the dark room. However, the maid knew very well what she had seen. An elderly woman in the family asked for a candle so she could see what was happening. The old woman began to pray as fast as her lips would allow and led the group with a candle in her hands. The woman hadn't gone more than a few steps when she stopped short. There was a white cat on the chest of the corpse. She asked everyone who had let him in and whose it was, but nobody answered. It wasn't a house cat and no one had ever seen it. Suddenly, the cat scrambled onto the cushion beside the corpse's head. In casting a glance at everyone present, slithered slowly along the body, meowing slowly but fiercely as it approached. Everyone left the room terrified, closing the door behind them. During the 2 days that the body was kept at home, every time someone entered the room, the cat was on top of the corpse. No matter how many precautions they took and how many times they kicked him out of there, the animal reappeared accompanying the deceased. Since then, the white cat appears to my family when someone is about to die. It's like it's the messenger of death. We think it's the ghost of my great-uncle's ex-girlfriend who takes that form when she shows up. Each member of our family who dies in Drumconial sees the white cat first and knows that he has only a few days to live. I'm not sure, but I think I've seen a white tail around my house. Who is it looking for this time? Hello, horror lovers. Today's story takes place in a convent located in the outskirts of a small town in eastern England. As we have all heard, life in a convent is not easy, as they can be very closed off, isolated, and cold places. They have very strict schedules, both for praying and for the different daily tasks nuns have to do. Not to mention the celibacy and the vow of silence. To be able to stand such a daily routine, you need to have a lot of faith, as well as getting along well with others. The head figure in a convent is the abbot, which means father. Things started to go south when out of a sudden the abbot of the convent disappeared. In its place, they found a note explaining that he would be absent for a few days. He had been summoned for an urgent meeting at the Vatican Square, so he had to depart immediately. The note also mentioned that to fulfill his functions during his absence, he asked a substitute for help. He would arrive in a few days, so until then, all the nuns would be in charge of running the convent. There were no issues during that time. The nuns always arrived on time to pray and did all of their chores as sisters. They kept the place clean, visited the town schools to spread the word of the Lord, made handicrafts to sell, etc. 4 days later, someone knocked on the convent's door. The new priest had arrived, and all the nuns came together to welcome him in order to make sure he was as comfortable as possible. However, as soon as they saw him, they all shuddered. He was an older man, wearing ecclesiastical clothes. He was wearing a black robe, which complemented his cold and piercing gaze. He went into the building without stopping to greet the nuns who were waiting for him. He then went into his quarters and locked himself in. His behavior made the nuns break their vow of silence, since they were all disconcerted and scared by the first impression that man had produced in them. After a while of talking to each other, all the nuns went back to their respective rooms. And same as every day, they would get up at 6 in the morning to sing the chorus, go to Mass, and receive the Holy Communion. During the ceremony, they all took notice of how the new abbot skipped the initial prayer. He then took out a chalice filled with a reddish liquid, allegedly wine, and then gave a bit to drink to each nun while saying, "He who drinks my blood will live in me, and me in him." 2 hours later, all the nuns woke up between incense smoke and inverted crosses. The abbot who gave them his blood to drink now had his skin and eyes completely red, had 2 horns on his head, and an evil smile was drawn across his face. All the nuns got out of that room and went directly to the town, armed with knives and torches, burning everything standing in their path. They cruelly killed everyone they saw and took their bodies to their leader. The next night, someone knocked on the convent's door, saying he was the substitute abbot. The nuns opened the door, and the screams of pain he let out would have been heard in the entire town. If there was still some left alive there, the actual substitute abbot ended up hanged from a huge crucifix in the same room where the nuns prayed and drank wine. And that's the image the first abbot had to witness when he came back from his meeting in the Vatican. The legend says that many years ago in a town lived a mother with her 3 children. Misfortune had knocked on their door when the father of the family died in an accident, leaving the wife alone with the children. After a while, the woman found a new partner and remarried. Again, there were 5 at home, but unfortunately this union was critical for the children because their stepfather was violent towards them. He mistreated them secretly from their mother for no reason and imposed severe punishments such as taking away their food, denying them water, or locking them in the basement. Although his behavior was mean and abusive towards all the little ones, much of his anger was vented on the eldest daughter, who received the most beatings and scoldings. On one of those occasions, the man was blinded by his fury and violently threw the girl down the stairs, causing her death on the spot. Frightened by the possible consequences, the stepfather fled, and the mother, with her 2 little ones, decided to leave home to avoid remembering every day the death of the minor on those stairs. The house was put up for rent, and it went through several tenants, but all of them were short-lived. They claimed to hear a child's voice asking for help. The house became a scene of terror. Screams and wailing could be heard, and the doors opened and closed by themselves. The spirit even came to knock on the door to ask for water. The most disturbing thing was that when someone passed by on the stairs, he could feel their presence. It was as if the girl was placed in that place where she had met her death. It isn't known if she was taking care of the other tenants, trying not to let them fall down the stairs, or if she was waiting for the right moment to push them and make them suffer the same fate. Some claimed to see her, others only heard her. Although they were unaware of their intentions, for some people these paranormal events were enough to scare them for life. Although no other person died while the house was inhabited, rumors made it so that no one else wanted to live there. It is said that the house remains abandoned in the middle of the field, and that some nights, hikers who passed by came to see the ghost of a girl leaning out of the window, sometimes asking for help, other times just watching them in silence. If you know the area and risk going in, never go near the stairs. Better not to know the intentions of this spirit.
Hello, horror lovers. Living together with strangers can be either the best or the worst experience of our lives. It's very important that you learn about who you will be sharing a living space with before you end up experiencing a terrible surprise, just like it happened in Bremen, Germany. Christian needed money. He couldn't just cover the expenses of the house he rented while studying abroad. That's why he had the idea of sharing one of the rooms that he did not use. He took photos of the entire house and made accounts in a few websites to advertise it online. A few days later, he was jolted awake with a phone call coming from an unknown number. Normally, he wouldn't give it any importance and would just keep going on with his day, since it was usually companies trying to sell him products. However, this time around, the caller left him a message. It was the voice of a young man asking for the price of the room and the address of the house to go see it. The young man said he was a student from another city who was coming to Bremen to start his career. Christian's room was the cheapest for the student, while being the closest to his university. Thus, Christian decided to call the student back, and a few minutes later they arranged a day and time for his visit. The student came punctually at the established time. He told Christian that he loved the place and that it had everything he needed. The student also pointed out that for him, privacy was very important, and that he didn't want anybody to go into his room under any circumstance. And so, they closed the deal, and the next month the student moved into Christian's house. At first, their cohabitation was all right. They barely saw each other, since the young man studied in the mornings, while Christian went to work at noon. But even then, they would still eat dinner together, and would talk about their day while eating. This went on for a couple of months, until the student started having strange attitudes. First, a horrible smell was now coming from his room. Second, the student gradually became more distant. He no longer waited to have dinner with Christian, and wouldn't even say hi when they bumped into each other. And so, Christian would only talk to the student to insist that he sorted out that bad smell coming from his room. Weeks went by, and the smell was getting so horrible that it became unbearable. Thus, while the young man was still at university, Christian took advantage of that to go get into his room. He just couldn't stand living under these conditions any longer, especially without knowing what was causing such a horrible stink. Christian grabbed the doorknob, turned it, and slowly opened the door. It was very dark, so he turned on the lights. The room was completely messy, with a bunch of stuff thrown on the floor. Christian then heard something dripping, and when he observed the room more closely, he noticed a red liquid at the foot of the closet. He then went to open it, and couldn't believe what he was seeing. Hanging human corpses, as well as bags which seemed to be filled with organs. On the side was a saw, and a dish with a knife and a fork on it, all covered in blood. Christian rushed out of there. He had to get to the police station as soon as possible. He waited for the elevator's door to open, and when it arrived, he found himself face to face with the alleged student. After a very brief greeting without looking at the student in the eye, Christian went in and pressed the button. That murderer would go into his room and would find his closet opened and the lights on. Christian didn't have much time. When the police arrived, the room was just as Christian had described it. All the grotesque elements were still there, except for the sadistic murderer who was never found and never heard from again. Maybe that killer moved to a different country and changed his identity. And who knows, he might have been living in somebody else's house. And that homeowner will have no idea about the kind of monster they'll be sharing a roof with.
How are ya, horror lovers? Today, we tell you the story of a young woman who walked every night in her wedding dress and a long veil covering her face. She always walked with her doll, which was special because it had the body of an ordinary doll in the shape of a baby, but the head of a pig. Everyone in the village saw her walking among the trees, rustling the leaves. She always made the same route and with her head lowered. The neighbors wondered what had brought her to this situation of depression and madness. Some launched theories about a breakup with her partner and he had left her standing at the altar. Others said that it was something more serious, like the death of her future husband. And that was why she always went out with the wedding dress that she never wore. However, the most striking was the affection and delicacy with which she treated her doll. She carried it on her lap, cooing at it as if it were her baby and alive. Everyone saw the pig's head on the toy. Otherwise, they would surely think it was their son. For this reason, other neighbors argued that the reason for her disorder couldn't be other than the loss of a child. They all thought they knew the truth about her, but no one spoke to her. They were used to seeing her walking daily, but there was something about her that caused them fear. If she had a serious personality disorder like schizophrenia, she might react in a violent way. So everyone avoided her and looked at her from afar. On the other hand, boys sometimes bet on who was able to get closer to the bride without fear, to prove their bravery. One day, one of these boys wanted to prove that he was the bravest of the group and claimed that he would not only approach her, but would dare to talk to her. All the friends put some of their toys in case the boy got what he promised, and they hid among the trees to watch him. The young man stayed in the middle of the road, waiting for the woman to appear. When she came wandering in, he swallowed hard and asked in an impertinent tone, "Hey, why do you always take out that hideous doll with a pig's head? It's awful. You know it's not alive, right?" The woman slowed her pace and fell silent. Suddenly, a nasal and childish voice answered the young man's question. "I am the one who takes her out for a walk, and it is she who is not alive." Then the veil and the dress collapsed to the ground, showing that there was no one under the cloth. The pig-headed doll cried sadly, lying on the ground, while the boy ran after his friends. Everyone was screaming in fear after what their eyes had witnessed.
How are you, horror lovers? Today we traveled to Cuenca, Spain, to tell you about a famous legend, the Devil's Cross. It is said that years ago there lived a very handsome young man with the gift of speech. All the girls were in love with him. The boy used all his charms to attract them, and after broken promises, he abandoned them and cheated on them. But one day everything changed. A young woman named Diana came to town. She was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and from the first moment she stole his heart. However, unlike the other girls, Diana rejected him. The young woman was well aware of the boy's reputation, and although she spoke sweetly and kindly to him, when he tried to pretend to her, she avoided him and evaded the subject. It was the first time the young man had been rejected, and far from giving up, he began to obsess over getting her to be his girlfriend. So he tried to win her over with flowers, love letters, and all the details he could think of to try to get her attention. One day the boy received a letter. It was from Diana, who had summoned him at the door of the Angustias church. In it, she told him that they would have a date on the night of the dead. That night, he couldn't contain his excitement. Finally, after so much work and rejections, he had managed to seduce Diana. He groomed himself, perfumed himself, put on his best clothes, and headed to the place where he had met the young woman. The sky was full of black clouds, but that didn't discourage him. When he reached the entrance to the church, in the rain, he found Diana dressed like a real princess. A wave of passion consumed him and he began to kiss her. Unable to contain himself, one of his hands lifted the girl's skirt. He was still kissing her when he looked down and saw a large hoof peeking out from under her clothes. At that moment, lightning lit up the sky, and the face of his companion changed completely. Diana had become the devil, a monstrous being that didn't stop laughing out loud. The boy, horrified, ran away and grabbed a cross that was nearby. He hugged that and prayed to God to save him. The demon reached the young man just as he hugged the stone and struck him with a claw that grazed his shoulder. When he opened his eyes, the beast was no longer there, but the traces of that scratch were, which were reflected in the monument. Currently, the paw is still on the cross of that church, where that night the devil was transformed into an innocent young lady to teach a rogue a lesson.
John and his sister Kate had arrived at the summer camp. She didn't want to stay there, but her parents had convinced her by offering to go to the amusement park when she got home. The siblings, aged 12 and 14, felt old enough to be left alone, giving them the impression that their parents were giving them a babysitter. Upon arrival, the siblings had to leave their bags in different places. The boys slept in one area and the girls in another. As the days passed, John's impression of the camp had changed a lot. There were not only small children, but also many boys his age and older. The monitors were young, and every day they carried out very fun activities in nature. The young man fit in very well with the group with whom he shared a room. They always played the games on the same team. One of his friends introduced him to Tracy. That girl was without a doubt the most fascinating young woman he had ever met. It was a crush at first sight. She was intelligent, adventurous, funny, kind. All the adjectives fell short. And luckily, Tracy thought the same about him, so they soon became a couple and they didn't separate all day. In all that time, Kate didn't want to participate in any activity. She always said that she was tired and she didn't feel like it. Although her brother thought she was only behaving this way because she didn't like the place and hadn't been able to connect with any of her peers. However, Kate began to lose a lot of weight, so much so that in 1 week it seemed that she had lost 8 kilos. She was very pale and she hardly ate. John got angry with her and told her that she had to eat, otherwise she would end up really sick. But Kate seemed gone. She was very strange. The young man felt guilty for having left her aside because of his relationship with Tracy. He had made his sister feel lonely and sad, so he tried to spend more time with her. That was when he realized that Kate was not pretending. Something must have happened to her because the next day she asked the doctor to see her. The monitor informed her parents that their daughter would be seen by a medic and he would tell her whether she should go home or not. When the doctor attended the young woman, he stated that she was like this due to malnutrition because she herself had decided not to eat. She did not have any disease, she just wanted to leave because she was not comfortable in that place. Therefore, the monitors tried to encourage her to socialize with her peers and to get involved in the activities. However, each day Kate consumed more and more. John, determined to find an explanation, sneaked into the girl's room while everyone was having breakfast. He checked his sister's backpack in case she had something hidden, and he even checked her bed. And suddenly, there was something that caught his attention. On the pillowcase, there were some small dark spots. It looked like dried blood. He wanted to get a better look at it and noticed that it weighed a lot, too much to be just a pillow. He took a pair of scissors and cut the cover. The top feathers flew, and suddenly John released the pillow from his hands with a cry. At the bottom, in the middle of the feathers, there was a monstrous animal with hairy legs. It looked like a giant tick. It was so swollen, it looked like it was going to burst. Night after night since Kate had arrived, this creature had plunged its trunk into her temple, sucking her blood. The wound was so fine and small that on the head it was almost imperceptible. For days, it had consumed her sister. Could you have a bug like this under your pillow? The Yakumama, also known as Mother of the Water, is a popular mythological creature in Peru. It's a snake, similar to the anaconda, but with a much larger size, reaching more than 50 meters in length and with a head 2 meters wide. It lives in the water, preferring the mouth of the Amazon River in the lagoons near the river. Legend says that the Yakumama rested in a lake with clear and calm waters in a fairly hidden area, so no one used to appear there. However, one day, a fisherman arrived by chance looking for new places. His surprise was immense. He had never seen such clean and serene waters. The man thought there would be many fish there, so he threw the nets into the lake while rubbing his hands, imagining the fortune he would get. But soon after, his boat began to shake. At first, he didn't care. He thought it was some current, but the jolts were getting bigger and bigger, which made him alarmed. The man picked up the nets when the water began to form an intense eddy in front of him. And in the middle, emerging from the depths, he saw a giant snake with yellow eyes and a very long tongue at sand. The fisherman dropped the nets and began rowing with all his might to escape. Desperate, he prayed to the god Inti for help, who instructed him to row towards Lake Titicaca. As he advanced towards there, the vegetation that bordered the river began to grow exaggeratedly, covering his path. And meanwhile, the Yakumama followed him underwater. When the man believed that his end had come, 4 tapirs came from the shore and jumped into the water, fighting with the snake. Then the Yakumama turned around and the vegetation that blocked the path returned to its previous state. The fisherman took the opportunity to escape from there and managed to reach the other side, where he was finally safe. The man returned without fish, but he had kept the most valuable thing: his life. This popular Peruvian legend defines the Yakumama as a kind of Loch Ness monster in a snake version. For a long time, the indigenous people preferred to respect the calm waters of these lakes in order not to encounter this creature. It is said that it can launch large jets of water through its mouth, which with its power can even knock down trees. And that on occasions, its mouth is also capable of sucking at great distances, for example, sucking an animal that is 100 meters from it. Some versions of the legend say that it acts as a protector of the water, or of the Amazon itself. It's who dominates the climate, the rains, and the flow of the rivers. When the earth needs water, it goes up to the sky and it spreads like a gray stain, announcing itself with lightning and thunder, falling as rain on the ground. In this way, it makes plants grow, which serve to keep men alive. For some inhabitants of the Amazon, this snake represents the hope of eternal subsistence. However, these versions also emphasize his supernatural strength. When it moves out of the water, it leaves large trails in the jungle, with felled trees due to its size. Although it usually prefers to stay at the foot of the river, that is, where it waits for the arrival of prey, which it hypnotizes with its penetrating eyes so that it can hunt them. This legend lives on in the surroundings of the Amazon, and there are many who are still searching for the mythical Yakumama. Did you know about this creature?
It was St. Valentine's Day, and Walt and Emily were enjoying a romantic dinner under the candlelight. Emily had spent the entire day cleaning, decorating the house, and cooking. Walt opened the wine while eating the first dish. "Wow, Emily, this meat is wonderful. I've never tasted a stew this delicious. You're the best. Everything you make is great." Emily hadn't taken a bite yet. She seemed sad. Between laughter, Walt said, "Aren't you hungry? If you don't hurry, I'm gonna eat it all. Or are you saving space for dessert?"
I know everything between you and Margaret,
said Emily suddenly. Walt drank all the wine in his glass with a single gulp. "Margot? I don't know what you're talking about, dear. What's going on?" Emily then started to sweep off the breadcrumbs on the table. "You don't need to lie to me anymore."
You don't need to lie to me anymore. She showed me all the photos and messages. I know everything.
An uncomfortable silence filled the room. And then, trying to grab his wife's hand, Walt said, "Emily, I'm sorry. It all got out of hand and I never wanted to hurt you. But I love her. I love you both. I know it's difficult to understand, but I just can't kick her out of my life." The two started to cry. Walt didn't know what to do. Emily had been his first love, and he had shared everything with her. He loved the life that they had built together. But when he met Margot, everything changed. He couldn't understand how he could love two women at the same time, and so intensely. But that's how things were, and he wasn't capable of choosing just one.
Do you actually love her?
"Yes," said Walt. "I don't expect you to understand, but I love you too, Emily, and I've never stopped loving you."
Do you have her in your heart?
asked Emily. "Yes, like I told you, I do love her." Emily then lifted her gaze from the table, looked directly at Walt with her shining eyes and said,
Did you enjoy the meat in the stew?
Walt got really pale and shook his head in negation.
Now you also have Margaret inside of you, and so you can now be with both me and her forever. Hey there, horror lovers. In Argentina, there is a legend about a statue that was on Almafuerte Street in Paraná. It is said that there, years ago, a man made a pact with the devil. If the demon caused him to win the lottery prize, he would give him his soul and make a sculpture of his image for all to venerate. The demon fulfilled his part of the bargain, so the man began with his offering. However, shortly before he was finished, the town's residents heard a great cry of pain and suffering coming from his house. Nobody knew what happened to him, but his body appeared paralyzed with the same posture as the statue. The Argentines believed that the soul of the man had been locked up inside the said figure. It is said that some tried to throw it into the river, but shortly after it reappeared in the same place and without any damage. The following years, all those who walked along Almafuerte Avenue felt intimidated when passing in front of the house where the stone demon was. No one dared to throw it back or move it. They didn't want to have a tragic end like its owner. The statue was white, the size of an adult, with horns, a pointed tail, and a pointed beard. He had a wicked laugh and a chilling look. The left leg was kneeling, and the other served to support the arm on the same side. Some say that with the other hand he held his chin, although others affirm that he held a flute, which gave him a certain resemblance to a faun. The years went by, and in 1965, in the House of the Devil, a restaurant was installed. The place was called El Galeto de Oro, and hundreds of people used to go there for dinner, close to the disturbing gaze of the devil. The owner of the restaurant denied that this figure was related to a diabolical pact, but without a doubt, that legend attracted many customers who wanted to see this sculpture with their own eyes. When the building was bought by other owners, the statue disappeared. People say that they removed it from there, and in its place, they placed a fountain of holy water. There are no photos of the figure that aroused 1,000 stories and nightmares in the residents of Paraná, but those who came to see it still remember it. Do you think the statue was destroyed? Or that it still remains somewhere with the soul of the man who made the pact with the devil? Chile has many horror legends. Today, we travel to the island of Chiloé, located in the southern part of the country, to meet one of the most popular mythical characters in the region. The truko is a mythological being 80 centimeters tall, with an ugly face similar to that of an ogre, but with a special and sweet look that manages to attract the women who see him. He has no feet, his legs end at the ankles, and he wears a suit with a hat made of quinileja, which is a climbing plant that grows in the jungles of Chiloé. He always carries a stone axe with him. Depending on the versions, it is said that when he meets a woman in the forest, he uses the axe as if it were a cane so as not to frighten her. Although others affirm that in addition to the axe, he carries a twisted cane called pahueldum. Legend has it that he lives in the surroundings of the houses of the chilotes to observe the movements of women. He only persecutes those who go alone. He never acts when there are witnesses. He climbs high into trees to get a wide view and keep an eye on his victims. When he sees a woman he likes in the forest, he goes down quickly and hits the tree 3 times with an axe to scare her. When the girl recovers from her fright, Trauco comes to her side and gently blows her breath. The victim, unable to resist his charm, falls into a deep sleep without putting up a fight. Upon awakening from the spell, the woman returns home completely confused, not knowing what happened. As months go by, the woman's body begins to experience changes, until after 9 months she has a child, product of the spell of the strange little man. Sometimes Trauco may be interested in a woman, but he can't get close to her because she doesn't go out into the woods alone. When this happens, the being first communicates his presence to the girl by depositing his yellow droppings in front of the door of her house. Later, he announces his visit with sensual dreams, in which he transforms into a handsome young man to magically convince her. So little by little, he makes his way until he manages to enter through a door or window, pretending to be the man she dreams of. It is said that if the family realizes these facts, they should take precautions, since the trauco could enter transformed into a bush or quinileja, along with the rest of the branches or firewood used in the house, to wait for night and grab his victim. In some areas of Chiloé, when mothers suspect that this being is prowling their house, they leave a handful of sand on the table at night. The trauco is attracted to counting the grains of sand, and in this way, he forgets about the girl of the house. With the first light of dawn, he disappears with fear of being surprised by many people. So this would be a way to protect from him. Another way to keep it away would be to place excrement on the woman's body, because he's very neat with what he touches. Although we think the sand is enough. Many people in the area really believed these myths and legends and claimed to be pregnant with trauco, although there were also many who used it to cover up infidelity or an unwanted pregnancy. What do you think? Hello, horror lovers. Today, we'll be traveling to Carson, the capital of the state of Nevada in the United States. We'll be sharing with you a terrifying story that took place during the Three Kings Eve in 2012, when Mike was just 9 years old. That year, everything would be different. That would be the first Christmas he would not spend with his brother because of the accident 3 months ago. They had a tradition. Since he was the older brother and slept in the lower bed of the bunk beds, the night of the Three Kings Day, he would get up earlier and wake Mike up so they could open their presents together. 24 hours remained for that usually happy moment, but the permanent absence of Mike's brother sunk the family into a deep sorrow. Christmas Eve and Christmas Day were horrible, and they didn't even eat with other relatives. The mother, the father, and Mike stayed home and celebrated nothing. Mike woke up early and started doing his chores. The next day, he would be busy playing with his new gift, so it was better to complete the chores beforehand. When he finished up, he was so tired that he anxiously waited for dinner time to have a nap. When he woke up, it was already 9 p.m., so he imagined that he wouldn't be able to sleep that night. But that wasn't so. He ate dinner at 10:30 and went to bed at 11. Laying on his bed, he thought about how he didn't ask for anything special that year. He just didn't feel that he was missing anything. All he wanted was his brother back. He spent about 2 hours thinking about the past, remembering that time of the year from years before, when happiness was all around the house. The two brothers would get up as early as possible to open the gifts they asked for, while their father would film them from a corner of the room. Mike eventually fell asleep without realizing it, and had very strange dreams. Mike was completely conscious of everything he was doing and could even decide what to do and which words to use. Then he visualized someone he couldn't recognize because they were so far away. He started to approach them. They seemed to be in some sort of room, sitting on the lower bed of a bunk bed. Mike couldn't believe it. It was his brother, and he looked so real. Mike's brother looked at him and asked him about his life during the months they hadn't seen each other. But Mike couldn't think of anything special to tell. That's when Mike's brother asked him if he wanted to come with him. Mike didn't understand the question at first. Go where? But suddenly, Mike no longer had his brother in front of him, but a pale and monstrous face, with half of it disfigured and an eye completely covered by wrinkly skin. Mike woke up, trembling in fear, sweating and with his heart racing. He didn't know what time it was, so he looked at his alarm clock in front of his bed. 6 a.m. He thought that would be the time at which he would normally wake up to go open the presents. But then he heard a voice asking him if he was awake. It was Mike's brother's voice. Mike answered that he was awake, but still drowsy. Maybe he wasn't fully grasping the situation he was in. The voice told him, "Mike, look under the bed." Mike looked under the bed and saw right in front of him that same monstrously horrible face from the dream, approaching him. He couldn't contain a huge scream that woke his parents up, who rushed to his room and turned on the lights. After asking Mike what had happened and trying to calm him down, saying that it had just been a nightmare, they told him to go have breakfast and open his presents. The parents went away and left the lights on. Mike came out of the bed, still trembling, and that's when he realized that his brother's bed was unmade. Had it really been a dream? In an old house lived a woman named Elvira. She lived alone and she didn't have a good relationship with the neighbors of the town. Everyone walked away from her because of her bad character. Every day, she hung her clothes on lines under a window, which overlooked a square where young people gathered. Every time a child approached her house, the woman scared him away with screams and threatened him if he got to stain her clothes. Among the clothes, she always had a silk veil, very fine and white. It was obvious that it was special to her because she tended it delicately as if it were a treasure. One afternoon, after several hours of rain, the sun finally appeared, and the children went out to the square to play. One of the smaller ones kicked the ball hard, which ended up just under Elvira's clothes. Everyone else hid while the little one had to go retrieve the ball. Inadvertently, he tripped over a puddle of mud that had formed near the house. He saw that several brown drops had stained the lady's immaculate veil. Terrified, he wanted to clean it up a bit, but only managed to stain it more because his hands were also dirty. Suddenly, he noticed that the window opened. As soon as Elvira saw the little boy with muddy hands clutching her veil, she began to yell at him uncontrollably. The frightened boy began to cry. He apologized, saying that he had stumbled. However, the woman came out of the house, gave him a yank on the ears, and warned him that if he came any closer, he would regret it. The little boy ran away crying and told his friends what happened. Here in the story, the young man decided to take revenge on the lady. As soon as the sun went down, they threw several pieces of toilet paper into the puddles and then threw them into the house, leaving it filthy. They didn't believe that the woman was awake at that hour, but suddenly the old woman opened the door and grabbed the first child she found, who unfortunately was the little one who had soiled her veil. The young man screamed for help, but Elvira dragged him inside and closed the door. The other children ran home to warn the adults, and a little later, the little boy's parents banged on the woman's door, screaming. However, no one opened. Some suggested calling the police, but the minor's parents were unwilling to wait any longer, so with the help of several neighbors, they forced the door and entered. The mother's screams roared through the town as she entered the room. The lady, with a dirty veil on her head, was kneeling on the bloody floor, and around her were the child's teeth and fingers. The neighbors removed her veil and saw that her face had been disfigured. It seemed that she had been consumed. The mark of all her bones under the skin could be seen with the naked eye. She was dead. Suddenly, from behind the sofa, the little boy came out sobbing with blood in his mouth and squeezing the blood that still flowed from his severed fingers. They say that the devil had made a pact with the woman. She was to give him young souls in exchange for her immortality. However, that young man managed to escape at the time of the sacrifice, and the devil ended up taking Elvira's soul forever.
Harry knew his behavior was wrong. His father repeated on many occasions that the young man had the devil himself in his body. His mother refused to believe him. For her, Harry was mischievous like other boys his age. The father got tired of the situation and left home, and Harry was left alone with his mother. She told him every day not to play in such a rough way, and that he couldn't hurt the other boys. But he couldn't help it. He was attracted to the forbidden, and he loved the adrenaline that caused him to do evil acts. After a while, her mother couldn't take it anymore. She was sorry that she had defended her son and separated from her husband. The situation was untenable, but she didn't know how to fix it, how to make his behavior improve. The recent events had been too serious. She could no longer justify them as a prank. The police couldn't know either. What could they do to her little child if they found out? She had to hide him until his behavior improved. No one could know that the young man was there. Not at school, not his family. It was the only solution. Locking him up wasn't going to be an easy task. Her son was no longer that sweet 5-year-old angel who she could punish without leaving. She had a 16-year-old teenager with much more strength than her, and who could hurt her if he knew her intentions. So, she had no choice but to mix some sleeping pills in his food. When her son's head fell on the table from sleep, she dragged him to the basement and chained him to one of the columns. He had prepared a kind of room. He had a mattress on the floor, some books to keep himself entertained, and bowls of food and water. She waited by his side until he woke up. When the young man woke up, he began to insult her and demanded that she release him. The mother burst into tears and asked her little boy to reconsider. He had to find the goodness in his heart. The young man calmed down, and as if he had a split personality, he suddenly spoke to his mother in a sweet and delicate voice. "Mommy, why are you doing this to me?" The mother burst into tears and told him what he had done to his neighbor had not been right. They were all looking for him. "Mommy, it's because she messed with me. I had to defend myself." The mother approached him and while stroking his hair said, "I know, honey, but ripping his heart out with your hand was wrong. You have to learn to talk about things. You can't use violence for everything." After a few seconds of silence, she told him that she would have to admit him to a psychiatric center. The young man changed his expression. He didn't like the idea. He got up, walked as far as his chains would allow, and was able to reach the light switch, turning it off. The mother began to tremble. "Harry, darling, you're my little boy. I know you're good." The young man grabbed her in the dark and whispered in her ear, "No, I'm not, Mother." How are you, horror lovers? Today we travel to Mexico to bring you the legend, the Street of the Lost Child. It was the year 1659, and Mr. Adrian de Villacaña, a rich and powerful man, traveled from Europe to America with his little son Laro, after the death of his wife. When he arrived in Nueva España, what we now know as Mexico, he bought a large house and hired several servants. After a year, Mr. Villacaña was diagnosed with a rare but serious illness. But what scared him was not death, but leaving his son completely alone. so he decided to find a new wife as soon as possible. Many women presented themselves to Mr. Adrian, but none managed to impress him until he met Mrs. Elvira. The man fell in love with her, and since he knew he had little time, he decided to ask her to marry him 3 days after meeting her. The woman quickly went to live with them. However, the boy didn't feel comfortable with her. He asked his father to throw that woman out of the house, warning him that she was bad. But the man, believing that it was still difficult for the little boy to accept someone taking the role of his mother, encouraged him to get to know her better. Months passed, and the situation with Elvira and Lauro didn't improve. They argued all the time. The stay in the house became unbearable with the screaming, until finally one day everything was filled with silence. Something had happened. The boy had disappeared. It was night when the servants told Mr. Adrian that they couldn't find the little boy. Villicagna told his wife that their son was missing. However, the woman barely turned to look at him, replying in a despotic and rude manner that she didn't care. Don Adrian was horrified, but at that moment the most important thing was to find the little boy. So without wasting time, he organized a search group. They all went out with torches at night, desperately shouting the child's name. Weeks passed and Lauro didn't appear. The man was more distressed every day. However, his wife acted as if nothing had happened, walking through the streets with her expensive dresses and with a perverse smile. That same afternoon, the man began to feel much worse when the expected tragedy occurred. Mr. Adrian died without having found his little one. From then on, Mrs. Elvira remained the sole heir to all his wealth. However, no one loved her. Everyone blamed her for the tragedies that had happened in her house. No one went to her parties or visited her, which caused Elvira to fall into madness. The years went by until one day, while one of her maids brought her breakfast, Elvira began to yell at her that she hadn't killed the child. Seconds later, after a horrible fit of madness, the lady threw herself out the window. At that moment, a key fell to the floor. The maid grabbed it, and together with her coworkers, they went one by one through all the furniture in the house to see where that key was from. Suddenly, a door that had always been closed opened by itself, and immediately a horrible plague invaded the environment. Inside there was a trunk. They went over and tried the key. The object split open and the servants cried out in terror. Inside was little Lauro with his hands tied and his mouth covered with one of Mrs. Elvira's handkerchiefs. From then on, no one wanted to enter that place, and the street was nicknamed the Street of the Lost Child. Penny left work very late. Like every night, she drove her car along the deserted road back home. That day she was very tired, and the road was long, so she decided to stop at a service station to fill up the gas tank and stretch her legs, and have a coffee while she was at it. She didn't want to fall asleep at the wheel. After a few minutes, she decided to resume her journey. But soon she saw through the rearview mirror how a car was behind her and made signs with its lights, turning them on and off. Penny was terrified. She didn't recognize the car's license plate, so she decided to speed up. The car behind, far from giving up, increased its speed and began to intermittently put on its high beams. Penny kept speeding up. She was on a traffic road. There were no houses and no one to call for help. Suddenly, the car behind came so close that it hit her rear bumper. The young woman didn't understand anything. She didn't know if he was someone who had drunk too much and didn't know what he was doing, or if he was someone dangerous who wanted to hurt her. She kept accelerating, trying to gain an advantage with the car behind, until finally, and with her heart about to explode, she managed to enter the city roads. There was much more light there, and with the curve, she managed to leave her pursuer behind. When she managed to get home, she ran out of the car to get to the door as quickly as possible. Upon entering, she locked the door and looked out the window. She couldn't believe it. The car that was chasing her parked right behind hers. He had followed her home. A short, frightened man got out of the car and, looking out the window, yelled at her, "Don't open the door. Call the police." Penny didn't understand anything. Why was this man who had chased her telling her to call the police? Suddenly, a man in a long trench coat and carrying an axe got out of her own car. With a firm step, he lunged at the driver who was chasing her and dismembered him in a matter of seconds. Penny couldn't contain her screams of hysteria. That driver who was chasing her, the only thing he wanted was to warn the woman that there was someone in her back seat. At the gas station, he had seen how the killer had broken into the woman's car while she was buying her coffee. The next day, the police found Penny's body in her house with broken window panes. Despite all the investigations, the killer in the back seat was never identified.
Welcome, horror lovers. You've probably heard about a clan that supposedly rules the world from under the shadows, the Illuminati. Multiple theories that talk about their existence also assert the existence of the reptilians and the Masons. There are people that get so into these ideas that they dedicate a huge portion of their lives to dismantle the plans of these organizations, just like it happened to our journalist. He had to cover an important meeting taking place at the United States Congress. The world had just endured a global crisis, and it had to be reorganized to combat all the damage the nations had suffered. This event was so exclusive that they only allowed one journalist per newspaper. At the entrance, all the journalists were patted down to take away their phones, so they wouldn't be able to reveal sensitive information about the world leaders. All they could bring was a notebook to take notes. However, once the meeting was supposedly over, our journalist hid behind one of the large curtains without being noticed. He knew they were about to kick out all the journalists in order to talk about other issues, so he hid to hopefully go unnoticed and be able to hear them. Some other presidents were also taken out, while the presidents of the world's most powerful countries remained inside. And then a few hooded figures entered the room. They donned long black tunics with a triangle embroidered in their back. The politicians took a seat after bowing to them. They spoke in a language our journalists couldn't recognize, although it seemed to be a mix between Sumerian, ancient Egyptian, and Latin. Then suddenly, someone who seemed to be a security guard went into the room, alerting everyone present that one of the journalists didn't pick up his belongings at the entrance, and was likely still somewhere in the building. All the people in the room went out of there to talk in a different place, but not before visually checking the room. There was nowhere our journalists could escape to without being seen. The Congress building was always very well guarded, especially that day. He waited for 10 minutes to make sure nobody was around those halls, and then came out. Unfortunately, as soon as he tried to go through the door, a strong blow in his back made him fall unconscious. He woke up, tied from his hands and feet and with his torso naked. In front of him, a masked and hooded figure held his notebook. Our journalist was done for. The figure checked the notes the journalist had jotted down while hidden and gave him two options: be imprisoned for life or die suffering. Our journalist was sure that threat was real. He chose to die suffering. He wouldn't be able to endure living the rest of his life in a prison cell. The masked and hooded figure took out a live rat from a bag and placed it in the journalist's stomach. Then the figure quickly put a cage on the rat, trapping it. The hungry rodent would find a way to escape and eat. It would open a bloody hole through the journalist's skin, digging through his entrails, killing him in the end. The masked and hooded figure went out of the room and waited behind a door. 2 long hours of painful screams filled that room until finally, silence. And from the hole under the door, a rat covered in blood and entrails finally came out.
Carlos was traveling in Chile. Too many changes had taken place in his life. He had separated from his wife, had argued with a brother, felt stuck at work, so he decided to take a route through the Chilean country in search of tranquility and distraction. After a fantastic day visiting the Atacama Desert, he headed towards Antofagasta. There was the hotel where he was staying. He had been going around several times without finding the exact address, so he asked an old woman if she could help him locate himself. The lady very kindly offered to accompany him to the place, so he wouldn't get lost. Carlos was fascinated by the kindness and hospitality of the locals. Since he had arrived, everyone had offered to help without asking for anything in return. The young man was walking behind the lady through some streets that he didn't recognize, but he thought that they could be shortcuts that only the locals knew. They were increasingly separated from the city, and in darker areas. He was beginning to doubt that the old woman really knew the way, so he preferred to ask her, "Excuse me, madam, are you sure the address is this way?" At that moment, the old woman turned around, and Carlos let out a terrible scream of fright. A long, twisted tongue dropped from the woman's mouth. Her eyes were bright yellow. She had hooves for feet, and her fingernails had grown into huge claws. Carlos started to run desperately, but that creature threw itself on top of him, digging its nails into his neck.
His long tongue tasted the blood that oozed from the torn neck. Then it ripped apart his torso, cracking the ribs and creating a red puddle on the floor. With the lightness of a surgeon, it grabbed the heart with its fingernails and proceeded to savor its favorite part. When it finished the mouthful, it continued with the interior of the young man, disintegrating the body and swallowing all his organs. Minutes later, when it was satisfied, the monster straightened up. Its face grimaced with effort, and its body mutated into that of a cat. However, the hind legs were hooves, similar to those of a goat or donkey. With subtlety, the creature now turned into a cat, escaped from the scene of the crime without even a trace of having existed. According to legend, ghouls come out at night looking for victims to kill and devour. They can transform into whatever they want, people, animals, but what they never manage to change are their goat legs, so it's the only way that exists to distinguish them. Don't trust anyone you don't know without first looking at their feet.
Hello again, horror lovers. Today we'll be sharing with you the return of a very well-known ancient legend, especially in Spain. A long time had passed since we heard episodes of people bumping into this specter. And those who have experienced this terrifying adventure say that it always happens at night, in the middle of desolate roads, always at the outskirts of cities and towns. Nacho had been spending the night at the birthday party of one of his best friends. At first, he said that he would leave at 8 p.m. He was far away from the city and had an exam the next day. However, the party stretched out until 3 a.m., which is when he finally decided to head back home. Nacho drove carefully through the highway while drinking coffee. He was exhausted and couldn't allow himself to fall asleep. He turned on the radio, turned up the volume to the max, and put on his favorite playlist to try and make the trip a bit more bearable. But suddenly, he visualized something white at the horizon, right on the long and straight road in front of him. A bit puzzled, he thought that maybe it was just his imagination. He shouldn't be driving when he was exhausted. He continued driving, but slowed down the car until he could clearly see whatever that figure was. As he got closer, the figure of a woman dressed in white started to take shape. She was standing right in the middle of the road. Nacho stopped by her side and rolled down the window, thinking that maybe she had had an accident and needed help. With an expression of shame and shivering due to the cold, that beautiful young woman asked if he could take her to Madrid. Nacho nodded and told her to get in since he was heading to Madrid too. She opened the door, sat in the back seat, and Nacho continued driving. Nacho tried to make conversation with the young woman, but she remained silent and with her eyes fixated on the road. He would nervously look at her through the rearview mirror, and he just couldn't understand what was going on with that silent and unusual passenger. They eventually reached a part of the road right before a sharp curve. The woman spoke with a shivering voice, asking the driver to please be careful and slow down since that curve was dangerous. Nacho was puzzled since he wasn't seeing any curve on the road yet and wasn't driving very fast either. Until the sharp curve emerged from the fog and Nacho had no choice but to swerve at the last minute. Fully alert and focused on the road after such a scare, he asked his passenger if she was okay. And that's when a voice behind Nacho said, "This is the curve where I died." A shiver went down Nacho's entire body. He turned his head with a nervous smile, thinking what she said was just a scary joke. But that young woman he picked up a few meters before was no longer there. It's as if she had evaporated. Nacho slammed on the brakes and got off the car. He couldn't understand any of what was going on until he saw a few white flowers by the side of the road with a note that said, "Here lies Teresa Fidalgo." Nacho quickly got back into his car and continued driving, shivering, and constantly looking at his rearview mirror in case that ghost reappeared. He decided he had to go report this at a police station. He spoke with one of the officers to report what he had experienced, and the officer's response completely changed Nacho's expression. The officer said that he was the third person that night who had reported that same event. The officer then turned on his walkie-talkie and, with a shivering voice, "The girl on the curve is back."
James was dead. His wife Sarah and their children, dressed in black, gave him their last goodbye by throwing a red rose on top of the funeral box. When Sarah got home, she kicked off her heels, showered, made herself a coffee, and covered herself with a blanket on the couch. Suddenly, her mobile phone rang. On the screen was the number of her deceased husband, James. She picked up the call and listened. "Sarah, honey, you have to help me. I don't have much time." She asked in a strange voice, "Who was it?" To which her husband replied in a weak voice, "Sarah, it's me, James. I don't have much air left. They buried me. They buried me alive." "What James?" she asked. "What James? I'm your husband. Please, you have to come save me. It's very cold and I'm running out of oxygen." Sarah froze for a moment, but she pulled herself together and told her husband that she would call one of her sons to help him. He had to stay calm and not hang up, so she would know he was alive at all times. Her husband, his voice weakening, told her that he didn't remember how he got there. He only remembered dining at home alone with her. She had prepared a delicious stew for him, and the wine was spectacular. He had never tasted anything like it. Sarah hadn't eaten a bite, settling for a small piece of bread and a glass of water. She smiled and enjoyed watching him eat. She knew he was loving it. "Oh, Sarah, you've always been so good to me, even though I've disrespected you so many times. Now I understand that you were always the woman I deserved. Good housewife, cook, you always had my clothes clean and ready. You put up with my anger, my bad mood. You've always been there, until the end." Sarah stared at nothing as she sipped her coffee. Then she answered with a cold voice, "Don't you think it's strange that they buried you with a cell phone?" James was silent. He didn't understand anything. It was true that there was no point in burying a corpse with a cell phone. Sarah drank the entire contents of her cup in one last sip, wiped her mouth and said, "I wanted to be the last to hear your cries after poisoning you and pretending to be dead. I wanted to hear how you writhed in your grave. I just wanted to be your last call."
Beth and her siblings loved playing with the animals on the family farm. Her parents weren't too excited about them rolling in the mud with the pigs and running across the meadow with the sheep. They always came home dirty and with the odd rip in their clothes, but seeing them so happy and content having fun in nature made it all worth it. That day, the brothers had already showered and dined. After helping their parents, they went outside. They decided to play hide and seek, and Beth crouched down in the cornfields. Thomas, the youngest, saw several plants move, so he assumed that one of his brothers was among the corn. As he pushed aside several plants, what he saw left him transfixed, and a few seconds later he started screaming. Beth, who was nearby, ran towards his screams, and when she got there she could see how a grayish creature with a skeletal body took her brother in his arms. He was big and tall, probably more than 2 meters. The girl screamed for help, while throwing stones at that creature that didn't seem human. Her mother left the house panting, because the children were playing outside, and surely they had stained themselves again. In a calm voice, she asked them to go back inside, but when she saw her daughter with terror drawn on her face, she jumped down the stairs and screamed for her husband. The father left the house with his hunting gun, and the whole family searched with flashlights for little Thomas, but he didn't show up. Through tears, Beth tried to explain to her parents what the creature that had taken her brother was like, but they insisted that surely she had seen it wrong, because monsters didn't exist. They entered the area where the animals were, and the panorama was bleak. Pigs, horses, and cows lying on the ground bloodied. It seemed that they had been attacked by beasts, and in one of the corners they could see them. He was the creature Beth had seen. He was on his knees eating one of the sheep. The father raised the gun pointed at him, while his hands and legs trembled. Beth clung to her mother's arms and the man fired. At that moment, the creature emitted an intense shriek that made the family go deaf. A horrible buzzing had taken over their heads, and they fell to the ground unconscious. Later, they woke up and got up. They went outside and could see 5 or 6 creatures like that, who were lost in a blinding light in the distance. The following days, nearby farms had similar episodes, where all the cattle had been mysteriously killed. Investigations were opened, but no one could reach those horrible creatures. Today, they're still looking for little Tommy. His body didn't appear, nor any trace. Will these monsters still be among us?
Sonora is a state with legends and chilling stories. Each region has different stories, and Hermosillo is no exception. There we find the legend of its old convert, which will leave you with goosebumps. It is believed that during the 19th century and the first half of the 20th, the Hermosillo nunnery was a place where women went to hide their unwanted pregnancies, but not all women went voluntarily. Many were forced sometimes by their parents and others because they were judged by society for being pregnant at an early age. There they repented before God, and their children were taken from them. For days later, they were instructed to adopt the lifestyle of the nuns. Others, simply after arriving there, disappeared. It is said that these forced disappearances were ordered by the Mother Superior, who was a true tyrant. She had a peculiar way of understanding religion, linked to torment, torture, and murder. Many of the women who arrived against their will had a fatal fate. Their children were taken from them, and they were subjected to physical punishment with irons, spikes, and starvation, among many other tortures. The Mother Superior assured that these women had the devil inside their bodies, and that the child they engendered should die, since it would be the son of the devil. Thus, many women died from the cruel punishments, and others who managed to survive were left with serious and irreparable mental consequences. Little by little, with the rumor of these acts of cruelty, the high ecclesiastical command declared its closure. However, the most chilling still remained to be known. In the second half of the 20th century, works began to be carried out around it, and they decided to tear down the abandoned convent to build a new building. When the workers began to tear down the thicker walls, inside they found several skeletons of women, fetuses, and newborns. Those women who came asking for help and their babies had been killed and hidden within the walls of that horrendous place. It was also rumored that many of the children were children of the nuns, who had to hide them from the eyes of the Mother Superior. Legend says that if you walk down Certain Street at night, you can see the banshees of pregnant women crying and complaining disconsolately. They don't walk, they float and cry out in suffering for having lost their children. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. And if you want to see more horror videos, subscribe to our channel.